Welcome back to the Controversy Corner, Boils and Ghouls. In this series, we examine lawsuits, frauds, feuds, and other unsavory events having to do with the comic book industry. And this episode is a special one. Arthur Suydam was once one of comics' most promising and respected artists. After decades of working his way up the ranks from a teenage hire at DC by Joe Orlando and reaching underground prominence with his work in both Epic Illustrated and Heavy Metal, Arthur Suydam finally reached the pinnacle of the industry after his work on Marvel Zombies in 2006. While a number of things helped Suydam stand out on the stands at the time, his knack for contorting the images of some of comics' most famous covers into bizarrely twisted and humorously grotesque homages would both skyrocket him into stardom and be the eventual cause of his downfall as well. It wasn't long after the massive success of Marvel Zombies, which Suydam did with Walking Dead scribe Robert Kirkman during his own rise to superstardom, that Suydam began to seemingly self-immolate. Suydam regularly began being accused of a host of sordid deeds almost immediately following his rise to prominence after nearly 3 decades in the industry, mostly stemming from his liberal usage of elements and compositions from other people's work without proper accreditation. As a result, it would be less than 10 years later that Arthur Suydam was basically run out of the comic book industry proper by an angry mob of fellow industry professionals fed up with his ego and antics, and a growing number of disillusioned and angry former fans who had began to increasingly resent a number of things about the once prominent artist. One of the biggest names in modern comics for a brief time, finding out exactly what happened to Arthur Suydam, why he seems to have completely vanished from the public eye, and more importantly, why, was not easy. But tonight I present to you the full story of Arthur Suydam's troubled comic book career. So join me in this multi-part documentary series as we examine the surprising meteoric rise and eventual equally epic downfall of Arthur Suydam, the so-called Zombie King, and another tasty tidbit of tawdry industry trivia I like to call Arthur Suydam, the Controversy King. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, hit that like button. Think about getting in the comment section below and letting me know. If you really enjoy what you see, make sure you hog smash that subscribe button. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the links in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to tons of exclusive behind-the-scenes updates, uncut interviews, early access to content. You can even get your name in the credits. You can also use the Ko-Fi link in the description to make donations towards specific goals or just tip the channel, and if that's not enough, you can even pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen. But now, let's get into it. Before we get into the nasty in bits of this piece, I think it's important to look back on Arthur Suydam's beginnings as a creator in the field, his early work, and his rise to prominence. Not only was he once highly respected as an artist's artist, but there's been little, if any, serious coverage of Suydam's career as a whole to this point, which is kind of sad. He wasn't always known as the purveyor of purloined and appropriated images that he's become in modern times. In fact, at one point, as I said, he was one of the most well-respected professionals in the field by a lot of other professionals. He'd come up the hard way from Trenton, New Jersey, and overcome some fairly unbelievable obstacles starting in his childhood, at least the way Arthur Suydam tells it. While often prone to what I would congenially refer to as exaggeration, Suydam's upbringing doesn't really seem to befit the regal, stylish personality and lifestyle that he so adamantly portrayed in his later life. With nothing much to do in the sleepy suburbs where he grew up, Suydam and his friends often found themselves getting into what he refers to as, quote, Huck Finn mischief. While this might sound rather innocuous, in reality, it seems like Suydam had something of a crazy streak as a kid, to be honest. In interviews, when asked about his childhood, he would often make passing remarks about some rather insane stunts that he pulled, including hanging off the roof of a 5-story building with his friends in a contest to see who could hold on the longest. As it turned out, this was not Arthur Suydam, who ended up taking a pretty nasty tumble onto a picket fence 5 stories below. He talked about regularly scrapping with other local kids and all types of stuff, but everything else pales in comparison to one event, a near fatal accident that would prove to be perhaps the single most defining moment of Arthur Suydam's life, actually. When he was 5 years old, Suydam was playing with some other local kids from his neighborhood when he managed to catch himself on fire. And we're not talking like a little burn here. Suydam lit almost his entire body aflame. As a result of the accident, Suydam suffered horrific third-degree burns over more than 50% of his body. While it's often referenced in passing, I was only able to find one instance where he talked about it in detail. Suydam, however, went into fairly graphic detail, recalling the traumatic experience, saying, quote, "Playing with fireworks actually, a bunch of kids got together, tied a string to the end of a kite and tried to light a match to it. We thought it would fly off. But a burst of wind came along and blew the string into my clothes and set my clothes on fire. I remember running up on my porch and trying to get into the house to tell my mom, to get my mom to help me. The door was jammed and wouldn't open. It was stuck and I couldn't get into the house. I remember yanking on this crazy belt with no pin in it, trying to get the burning clothes off. The harder I pulled, the tighter the belt got. I was running around in circles on the porch and going up in flames. Finally, the Greek guy from down the street came running and threw a rug over me. That's what finally put the fire out." Suydam was in fact so badly burned by the incident that hospital staff had a very serious conversation about whether or not it was better to just let the poor child die rather than try and treat the horrific wounds that covered more than half of Suydam's 5-year-old body. Quote, "I was caught in a fire and burned over 50% of my body. They didn't expect me to live. There were discussions in the hospital that maybe they should not try to save me because I was burnt so badly. I remember the doctors telling my parents." Suydam's parents, however, were, how shall I put it, not receptive to that notion, especially his dad. Despite their numerous differences later in life, two things are pretty clear about Suydam's father. First, he loved his son deeply. The second is that he appears to have had one hell of a temper. While Arthur Suydam wrote this particular outburst off to their settings and circumstances, and I can certainly commiserate being a parent myself, but Arthur Suydam's father didn't just tell the doctors that they weren't interested. Quote, "My father threatened them. If you don't try to save my son, I'm gonna kill you." This could have been dramatics or hyperbole, but I don't think so. I also discovered a story from years later that well illustrates the type of temper I think that Arthur Suydam's father had. Following a disagreement with a neighbor over noise, there was an ensuing confrontation, and Suydam's dad ended up chasing a neighbor around their block, threatening him with a hammer. Quote, "I remember the next door neighbor trying to run me over with her Cadillac because she didn't like me picking my guitar when her husband got home from work. I was only a kid, 11 years old. I mean, the neighbor's husband was a drummer, and there is nothing on this planet as noisy as a drummer set in a house. He'd come home at night and be on his drum set for 2 hours, and you could hear that thing 2 blocks away. Never a word from us. Yet when I practiced my little guitar, she'd blow a gasket. She chased me down in her car, came up on the curb after me, then ran into the house to get her husband to come out to beat me up. Right then, my father pulled up in his car, got a hammer out from underneath of his seat, and chased him around the block a couple of times and then back into the house." Now, obviously, if someone is threatening your child, I understand getting upset. I'm a parent. But this doesn't seem like an isolated incident and seems more symptomatic of his father's personality. While he may have been a tad on the unhinged side from time to time, his father refused to let doctors give up on Arthur Suydam, or in turn let Suydam give up on himself. Burns are not only extremely painful, but they take a long time to heal. As a result of his accident, Suydam spent nearly an entire year in the hospital recovering from his grievous injuries. While it couldn't have been easy, this would prove a pivotal period for Suydam for a number of reasons, not the least of which being it was during this time he truly discovered and fell in love with comics. Quote, I was wrapped from head to toe in bandages, wrapped up like a mummy. On weekends, my parents would come to visit me and they would bring me comic books to read. DC's Star-Spangled War stories with dinosaurs, Legion of Superheroes, World's Finest, and Superman. At that time, those were my favorites. While he eagerly awaited his weekly comic fix from his parents while in the hospital, there was something Suydam looked forward to even more. Something else he loved maybe more than anything else in the world, as he explained in a 2006 interview. Quote, at that time, the single thing I had to look forward to was watching Superman on TV in the playroom. George Reeves. I was wrapped up like a mummy. I couldn't walk. The only thing sticking out of the bandages was my face, really, but once a week, being in that hospital for a year was utter hell. The thing I looked forward to the most was Superman. I was 5. I thought he was real at the time. I was absolutely convinced, and nobody could tell me differently. Like Santa Claus, that guy was real. While Suydam's infatuation with superheroes didn't last forever, between the comics his parents brought him on the weekends and the George Reeves Superman television series, during his extended stay in the hospital, Suydam fell more and more in love with comics. After a year, when he was finally released from the hospital and began doing physical therapy and rehab work where Suydam was literally learning to walk again, he began to train himself to draw as well, an activity he'd enjoyed before the accident but began to take a more intense interest in following the accident. Quote, when I finally was released from the hospital a year later, I had to relearn how to walk. As soon as they began to take some of the bandages off of my hands, I began to draw. I taught myself to hold a pencil between fingers that were less burned. Well, he says, quote, at that time I drew mostly dinosaurs with my older brother who also liked to draw, later animals, and then superheroes. Suydam's interest in art wasn't just limited to dinosaurs and superheroes though. From an early age, he appreciated the works of many of the old masters. Quote, I found magazines and other art books with classical etchings in the world of the Italian and Dutch Renaissance artists, Michelangelo, Bouguereau, and many other artists from that period. Adding these influences to his early exposure to comic books, Suydam appreciated the works of contemporary painters as well, in particular the work of Norman Rockwell, whose style would go on to greatly influence Suydam's own work, and in more ways than one, but we'll get to all of that in good time. While he usually just succeeds in coming off as totally pompous and arrogant in interviews when he talks about his influences, it's clear that Suydam was exposed to a wide variety of art from a young age, and his parents obviously appreciated art regardless of its designation or label. Despite his father not necessarily being super supportive of Arthur Suydam's choice to be a professional artist to say the least, this isn't to say that art and culture wasn't to be found in the Suydam household. Far from it, in fact, it seems. While his father might not have supported his choice to become a professional artist, this is actually rather interesting considering the family lineage that Arthur Suydam comes from and brags about at seemingly every opportunity that he gets. Suydam comes from a line of respected businessmen, high society hobnobs, and you guessed it, artists. It seems like one of the primary reasons that Suydam might have actually become so interested in classical paintings is his great uncle James Augustus Suydam. I wasn't able to uncover much in the way of how associated Arthur Suydam is with this part of his family, but his official write-ups would definitely lead you to believe it was in a big way. all things about Arthur Suydam aside, James Augustus Suydam was actually a pretty interesting guy. He was originally studying to be a doctor when his father died suddenly in 1841 while James was still a young man. He subsequently inherited a lot of money and abandoned his aspirations for a medical degree almost immediately. James Suydam spent the next year traveling across the continent, seeing the sights and experiencing life as he had never done before, simply taking it all in. When he returned home to New York, Suydam initially worked as a lawyer, and while I'm not entirely clear on how he made the leap from law to art, it's pretty clear that art was Suydam's real interest, with Suydam becoming rather infatuated after discovering it after his return to New York after his extensive travels. Though far from a master, Suydam was an accomplished artist during his lifetime, and more importantly for our story, heavily involved with many of the most prominent artistic communities and circles of the day. James Suydam was a prominent member of a number of the most elite New York art societies, including the Century Association and the St. Nicholas Society of the City of New York, and he was even officially elected a member of the prestigious National Academy of Design in 1861. Despite his numerous associations with many of New York's most prominent and important artistic communities, one credit towers among the rest. While not a founding member, Suydam was part of the second generation of the Hudson River School of Painting. This second generation of painters are most historically remembered at this point for a style of painting often referred to as luminism. Luminism was an artistic movement that took place as a result of an offshoot in styles from the founding members of the Hudson River School of Painting. Luminism is mostly concerned with a certain approach to the usage of light and a concealment of brushstrokes, both done so as to minimize the painter's own personality in the finished work, unlike many other styles of the period which emphasized the painter. While Luminism shares a similar approach to the effects of light with Impressionism, Luminism is typically characterized by an attention to detail and obfuscation of brushstrokes. Impressionism is conversely characterized by a lack of detail and an emphasis on brushstrokes, despite the two styles being often confused at first glance by novices. While the Hudson River painters never used or even identified the term luminism, James Suydam was instrumental in the evolution and promotion of what would become known as this style of painting during his lifetime. While James Suydam's paintings aren't necessarily the most famous, as I've said, he was a prominent member of the art community and high society in general, and he apparently utilized these connections to the benefit of several famous artists. Although he never achieved the artistic prominence he may have wished for himself, he did accomplish a lot in his life, although unfortunately James Augustus Suydam, much like his father, died of unknown causes extremely suddenly in September of 1865 at only 46 years old. Upon his death, Suydam willed $50,000, roughly the equivalent of $1.6 million today, as well as his entire collection of 92 paintings to the National Academy in New York. Though somewhat artistically unaccomplished himself, when they were cataloging James Suydam's estate and collecting the paintings for the National Academy, they reportedly discovered works by the likes of Rembrandt, Durer, Ostade, and even Raphael. If this doesn't give you a good idea of the artistic pedigree that Suydam has consistently clung to throughout his turbulent career, I don't know what will. This somewhat historied lineage seems rather strange when taking Suydam's life and career as a whole, however. While he consistently brings up his grand lineage in interviews, bios, and at basically any turn that he can manage, from all the reading that I did, it doesn't feel like Arthur Suydam or his family had much of anything in common with this titan of New York high society while living in Trenton, or even after their move further inland New Jersey while Arthur Suydam was still a child. Although Arthur Suydam had done plenty of dumb stuff and gotten into his fair share of trouble and mischief while in Trenton, including lighting himself on fire, according to his own accounts, once they moved, quote, a couple of miles inland, things were a skosh more serious. While New Jersey has always been notorious for having some rather rough areas and neighborhoods, Suydam shared a story about one of his friends that I think puts into perspective the kind of place that he and his family were actually living, which seems a far cry from the extravagant mansions and posh lifestyle of his great uncle. Quote, there were territories. You couldn't go into another territory. I remember these two brothers jumped one of my buddies. They cut his throat. We're talking about 13-year-old, 14-year-olds. The mischief on the river was one thing, but this was real trouble. During these formative years, in between hanging off of buildings, lighting himself on fire, and trying not to get his throat slit, Arthur Suydam continued to use comics as a way to escape from his humdrum daily life. Unfortunately, much like the stories of his youth might imply, his family doesn't seem to have been inordinately well off financially. Ironically, this lack of funds, however, would lead to an early infatuation for Suydam that would continue for most of his adult life. As an example of how his family didn't necessarily have the money that his famous relatives did, from what I can tell, Suydam fell in love with the works of both Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby almost completely by chance. Quote, in my early teens, I stumbled on the Marvel pre-hero sci-fi books from the title cut-off comic book returns because they were cheap, and that's what I could afford. 3 in a pack for 20 cents at that little corner dime store. The 60s sci-fi short stories with the great Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby art really caught my attention and called to me, and I became a big Marvel Comics fan. I spent all my money on comics. Not only does this illustrate the type of lifestyle I think Suydam has spent the better part of his adult life trying to escape, this early love of Kirby and especially Steve Ditko would not only stick with Suydam but also open the door for his next big revelation. A revelation which would drastically alter the course of Arthur Suydam's life without question. Quote, while trading comics with a local neighbor, I discovered these incredible large-size black and white horror magazine comics with the best comic art I had ever seen. Turns out those were the Warren books featuring many of the EC Comics faculty. Suydam became so obsessed with the Warren line of magazines that he actually made a vow not long after. Quote, I made a promise to myself that someday I would work for Warren Publishing. And apparently, Arthur Suydam wasn't joking. While a lot of people might have given up or just never even tried, intent on making his dreams a reality, during his senior year of high school, Arthur Suydam gathered up all of his samples, put together a makeshift portfolio, and set out for New York to pay Warren a little visit. Suydam not only succeeded in getting in to see the publisher, but upon seeing the young man's work, publisher Jim Warren apparently hired Arthur Suydam right then and there, prepared to give him work on the spot. That is, until he discovered that Arthur Suydam was still only in high school. Quote, my senior year of high school, I went up to visit their editor Jim Warren in New York to show him my work. Warren hired me on the spot. However, when I mentioned that I was still in high school, he informed me that I had the job if I wanted it, but to come back after I graduated. Suydam has said many times that he considered becoming a scientist because basically he didn't think you could actually make a living as an illustrator. This visit to Warren had changed all of that for him almost overnight, however. With offers from a few people and overjoyed that he'd accomplished his childhood dream to work on the Warren line of horror magazines following his graduation, Arthur Suydam returned home to New Jersey and waited impatiently for his impending graduation so he could start his new career as a professional illustrator in earnest. However, a single meeting just prior to his work for Warren started would change Suydam's career trajectory again, almost immediately, and for better or worse, Arthur Suydam never did have anything published in their black and white horror magazine line, or any of their books for that matter. While he moved to New York, from everything I can tell, to begin work for Warren, Suydam also made an appointment to see Joe Orlando. Orlando was an editor at DC at the time who had also worked for Warren as an art director as well as several other positions at the publisher just prior to all of this before he ever signed anything or even went back to see Jim Warren about work. While it's possible that Suydam was intent on meeting Orlando because of his connection with Warren, I wasn't able to find a real reason as to why Arthur Suydam would even bother setting up a meeting with another publisher if he had already been hired by Jim Warren and was indeed so intent on working for them as he's implied. Well, this doesn't really add up to me, and I get the feeling there's a little bit more to this story that Suydam is not sharing. I do know that this meeting with Joe Orlando changed everything once again for Arthur Suydam and did end up starting his professional career. As I said, the reason that Arthur Suydam was so interested in meeting Joe Orlando to begin with more than likely came from his previous association with Warren, who Suydam was moving to New York to work with. Quote, I stopped off at DC Comics to see editor Joe Orlando, who is managing a series of E.C. Warren-style horror comics for DC. During the interview, Joe informed me that he was the art director for Warren who had brought over all the great EC artists to work at Warren. This quote makes it clear, while he may have been aware that he worked for Warren, Suydam might not have known about the extent of Orlando's involvement with Warren prior to their meeting. Again, this makes the reason he even bothered to set up this sort of backup plan despite his claims of having already basically being hired by James Warren a little puzzling to say the least. During the meeting, however, I have no doubt that Orlando made it clear the somewhat questionable working conditions at Warren which had precipitated such major problems for them. Rather than take Jim Warren up on his offer, Joe Orlando instead implored Arthur Suydam to come and work for him at DC on the line of Warren-styled horror comics he was overseeing at the time. There was an incredible amount of talent that came out of those Joe Orlando edited DC horror books, and whether Suydam realized this fact or perhaps the truth of what Joe Orlando was saying, he simply liked Orlando better, or maybe the pay or assignments were just better. Rather than follow through on his childhood dream and do what he'd actually moved to New York to do, Arthur Suydam chose to abandon Warren before he ever even started there, opting instead to work for Joe Orlando and DC. Suydam has spoken inordinately highly of Joe Orlando over the years in numerous interviews, and he makes it seem as though Orlando instantly just handed him the keys to the castle when he hired him. Quote, after reviewing my portfolio, Joe asked me to work for DC Comics instead and to forget about working for Warren. Joe opened up a drawer and told me that there were 250 scripts in that drawer and that I could have as many of them as I wanted, and he handed me my first script and my pro career began. Hearing this, one would think that Arthur Suydam instantly came out of the gate swinging like many of the other artists that Orlando recruited around the same time to work on the horror lines he was overseeing, like Burning Wrightson or Mike Kaluta. This, however, was not the case for Arthur Suydam. Suydam did a paltry 2 stories for DC and Joe Orlando over the next 2 years. A Carnival of Dwarfs for House of Secrets 119 in May of 1974, and The Island of Crawling Flesh for House of Secrets 131 in May of 1975, a full year later. If Joe Orlando had offered him the keys to the castle as he claimed, this might seem a little puzzling, but according to Arthur Suydam, there's a rather simple explanation for this. It took him forever to finish stuff. Arthur Suydam, the gifted artist he might have been, had no clue what he was doing when it came to making a comic book. Narrative storytelling proved to be a difficult thing for Suydam to master as well, with Suydam admitting he never really bothered to learn the basics of either storytelling or drawing day-to-day objects, both of which were often required of comics work. These factors combined made his initial comic work a tedious and time-consuming prospect for Suydam, who was determined to put his best foot forward and prove to Joe Orlando that he had what it took and make him proud. Quote, That first story for House of Secrets took me a long time. I wanted to do such a good job for him. It wasn't out of laziness. I'm sure that's what he thought. I was so honored that he had put his trust in me that I wanted to do right by him. It was just a short story. I had not done much sequential art. What I had done had always been my own stories. When I was handed a script of someone else's ideas, it really threw me for a curve. 9 months later, when I showed up with this short, Joe Orlando calmly sat me down and told me what was right about it and what was wrong. He could have been rude and just kicked me out for taking so long, but he didn't. Realizing that taking a year on a single story was something of a problem, Arthur Suydam tried his best to speed things up, and his second story did go a little smoother, but still ended up taking him an inordinate amount of time to complete. Quote, I cut the time in half, 9 months down to 6. Suydam had repeatedly admitted he had never spent time drawing daily objects, and this, along with narrative storytelling, was a constant struggle which took him years to figure out. These early difficulties might actually go a long way in helping to explain the unsavory shortcuts Suydam ultimately began taking, although admittedly this wouldn't be until much later in his career. Around this time in 1975, Arthur Suydam enrolled at what he humbly refers to as a classical Atelier recreation of the school of Raphael, Michelangelo, and Da Vinci in New York City, modeled after their old study notes. Suydam is in fact referring to the New York Academy of Art and has spent the better part of the ensuing 4 decades since making sure that he brings up his studies at the prestigious institution at every possible opportunity. To hear Arthur Suydam describe it, you would be hard-pressed to think of a more strenuous or educational place at which to study art. Quote, it's kind of like special forces training in art. It's extremely grueling. It's 8 to 5 every day. There's a lot of anatomy work. I had to do a lot of work with cadavers. I drew them, painted them, sculpted them, and I was doing figurines for the medical university. While an absolute chore to read about when slogging through interviews, I have little doubt that this repeated mention of these studies would have placed Arthur Suydam in something of a unique position when it came time for Marvel to make a selection about who would handle the covers of their upcoming Marvel Zombie series. Arthur Suydam has himself, in fact, commented about this when talking about his formative years, saying, quote, I was watching nothing but horror movies and drawing horror stories for DC. Put all that together, and this is where the zombie thing comes from. Because of his rigorous studies and their time-consuming nature, as well as how long it took him to complete stories in general, Arthur Suydam would only publish a paltry 3 further stories starting in 1977 for DC Comics. Suydam's DC work isn't bad, but it didn't earn him much recognition or work, and he definitely didn't really come into his own until he started work for heavy metal in 1979. Arthur Suydam contributed a number of stories and illustrations to heavy metal over the next 3 years, but in June of 1981, the first of Suydam's breakout works, Mudwog, was published. Mudwog became a recurring feature, not just in heavy metal, but as Suydam began to branch out and work with other independent publishers throughout the 1980s especially, the title would actually end up popping up in a few places as well. Just prior to the publication of Mudwog, Suydam also began a lengthy and successful collaboration with Marvel's Epic Illustrated, which would create his best-selling and most fondly remembered series. Only months apart, Mudwog and Suydam's epic work would quickly cement Suydam as one of the most interesting and unique voices in comics at the time of their publication, as well as start an entirely new chapter in his career. Now, for anyone who's unfamiliar, Epic Illustrated was a magazine-style publication created by Marvel Comics. It was started in an attempt to directly compete with the other, more adult-oriented comic book magazines of the day, which offered writers and artists a great deal more freedom than traditional superhero books namely heavy metal. While Epic Illustrated didn't stick around for an inordinately long time, it did feature an impressive array of talent before it wrapped up publication in 1986, including but not limited to John Buscema, Jim Starlin, John Byrne, Terry Austin, Wendy Pini, Catherine Jeffrey Jones, Barry Windsor Smith, Bernie Wrightson, Stephen Bissett, Rick Veitch, Kent Williams, Richard Corbin, the brothers Hildebrandt, Boris Vallejo, and Frank Frazetta even did covers for the series. As a result of Marvel's attempt to keep up with the competition, many of these talents were attracted by the fact that not only was Epic Illustrated not submitted for approval by the Comics Code Authority, thereby making it a much more suitable place for artists looking for less editorial interference having to do with the contents of their stories, but for the first time, Marvel was offering ownership rights and royalties as part of the package to those creatives working on Epic Illustrated. This meant that stories were both free from tampering by the Comics Code Authority, and the creators were entitled to a larger portion of the profits, as well as still retaining the rights to whatever they created for the publication as well. Needless to say, while Marvel is notoriously half-assed a lot of what they've done over the years, Epic Illustrated was not one of them in a lot of respects. There were numerous steps taken to really make it stick out on the stands, including being printed on much higher quality paper than other Marvel comics, as well as utilizing a much more complex and expensive coloring technique in order to ensure the best possible printing of the work created for the series by the incredible talent. The paper, color, and printing techniques were actually so much better and so much more expensive that they would be some of the major precipitating factors that led to the series' untimely end after nearly 6 years on the racks following declining sales and interest. In 1981, however, along with the successful Mudwog series and heavy metal becoming a recurring series for the title, Suydam also created what would become the other major cornerstone of his career, Cholly and Flytrap, only 4 months later in October of that same year for Epic Illustrated, based on designs he'd initially made for the heavy metal movie poster. When they went unused, Suydam decided to give them a kind of second life in the Cholly and Flytrap series, which he was obviously making up as he went along, following a general aesthetic rather than actual story or even theme, really. Gaining popularity, Cholly and Flytrap initially ran for a year, ending in October of 1982 in Epic Illustrated, right around the same time the final Mudwog story saw publication in heavy metal only months later in January of 1983. After his sporadic work for DC, to put it lightly, and nearly 7 years in the industry already, things looked like they were finally starting to take off for Arthur Suydam, who also released his first portfolio right around this time in 1983 as well. The Mysterious Worlds of Arthur Suydam was extremely well received, and while it may be derivative of Frazetta's work, even today, that portfolio is still one of the best I've ever seen. The insane amount of detail, the luscious pen and ink work, and the composition in general make what became of Arthur Suydam later in his career a real shame, in my opinion. The Cholly and Flytrap and Mudwog work was impressive in and of itself, and it doesn't even vestigially resemble what the world would come one day to associate with Suydam's name as far as style or content. With all of the scantily clad buxom women one could ever wish for, bitingly original designs, luscious mixed media compositions, and plenty of action at this point, one would imagine Suydam would be poised to make the leap from the pages of Epic Illustrated and heavy metal to work on one of the flagship characters for one of the big two. Instead, Suydam began working with a myriad of smaller independent publishers during the 1980s, and I think there's a few reasons for this. I don't know the exact reasons that work for Marvel and DC never materialized at the time, but it's not hard to make inferred suppositions with knowledge of the latter half of Suydam's career. Given Suydam's preoccupation with the female form and the themes of his work, which are almost entirely adult in nature, when teamed with Suydam's disinterest in editorial interference or censorship that he espoused later in his career, likely this makes up the biggest part of why Suydam didn't do work for the big two at this point. Suydam, for his own part, has said that his continued work in the independent field, as opposed to Marvel and DC, had much to do with his refusal to compromise or change stories for publication. This This is backed up by some of the drama that he and Bob Caragoni would attempt to stir up in the pages of Penthouse Comics, and how the two attempted to ply artists' frustrations with other publishers into getting them to jump ship and join the Penthouse Comics team. I have no doubt that Arthur Suydam's subject matter had a lot to do with things, but honestly, it could just as easily have been his personality too. From all accounts, Arthur Suydam has basically always been a rather bombastic and braggadocious individual, earning him as many enemies inside the industry as fans from outside of it at any given time. Regardless of the hows and whys, work for Marvel and DC continued to elude Suydam, who instead put out a 2-issue horror anthology through Pacific Comics titled Demon Dreams in February of 1984. Shortly after Demon Dreams wrapped up publication, Suydam began his somewhat brief association with Neal Adams' Continuity Comics. He did a host of work for Continuity over the next 2 years, although most of this was for the Echo of the Future Past title from what I understand. If you're wondering how Arthur Suydam got hooked up with Neal Adams and Continuity, Pacific was actually the original home of Adams' Continuity Comics, and while I wasn't able to find anything empirical to back this up, I believe this is how Arthur Suydam became involved with the publisher, although the partnership didn't last inordinately long either way anyways. While it wasn't extremely long lasting, over the next 24 months or so, Arthur Suydam contributed a host of original Mudwog stories for Echo of the Future Past, eventually going on to contribute to all 9 issues of the series that ever saw publication, before its cancellation in January of 1986. Continuity never really managed to achieve the kind of success or market impact that many had hoped it would have, and Suydam seemed like he might as well be back exactly where he had started almost 2 years before publishing through Epic and Heavy Metal. However, out of the blue, following the end of Echo of the Future Past, it seemed like Suydam might actually make the leap to the big two, having his first Marvel cover, Savage Tales 2, published in December of 1985. Unfortunately for Arthur Suydam, Savage Tales was not extremely well received, only running a total of 19 issues across 2 volumes spanning more than 15 years. Unsurprisingly, as a result, the cover failed to ignite the interest or relationship with Marvel that Suydam likely hoped it would. As his career seemed to be stalled once again in the United States, throughout 1984 and 1985, Arthur Suydam was also beginning to become more well known on the international circuit as well. Interestingly, while he's actually never had any work published by Warren in the United States that I know of, he has had material printed in both Eerie and Creepy. Technically, Tutane Editor Editions from Spain has published several of his stories over the years, beginning around this time in 1985. While I've seen Arthur Suydam include this fact on his resume several times over the years, I've never seen him mention that the Eerie and Creepies that he's referring to aren't exactly the same ones that jump to mind for most people. He's not lying, but it seems like a real stretch, or at least a spin, might say, of the truth, to put it lightly to me. Regardless, as well as the Tutane Editorial Eerie and Creepy publications, which were printed several stories included in his Pacific Demon Dreams anthology, Mudwog stories were also being reprinted in a host of European publications throughout 1984, 1985, and 1986, attesting to his growing popularity in Europe. While this might have done little to help with getting comics work in the US, it probably did play a fairly large part in Suydam actually making a living in the industry, given his fairly limited amount of work to this point. Following Savage Tales 2 at the end of 1985, when the series and cover failed to ignite the intended interest, Suydam did what he would continue to do for the better part of the rest of his career. He fell back on what he knew. When Suydam hits on a formula or an idea that he thinks works or that people like, he's like a junkyard dog with a bone. There's just no getting him to drop it. With this in mind, Suydam quickly contributed another Cholly and Flytrap story to Epic Illustrated 34 only months after the Savage Tales 2 cover. This time though, it seems like Cholly and Flytrap were either starting to catch on, or Arthur Suydam had managed to impress someone at Marvel, because this time they gave Suydam and Cholly and Flytrap the cover for the first time for Epic Illustrated 34. With the continued interest in his Cholly and Flytrap, as as well as Mudwog series, which were being reprinted all over the world at this point, the epic illustrated cover, and a general growing interest in his work, the stage once again seemed to be set for Arthur Suydam to take the industry absolutely by storm. That is, if he could just find a way in, which it feels like he never really could for one reason or another. With all the possibilities that lay ahead of him, instead of making a big push or even falling back on more independent comic work like he had in the past, following the Cholly and Flytrap work for Epic Illustrated in February of 1986, he absolutely fell off the face of the earth. There was nothing, not even a pinup from Suydam after years of fairly steady work. It would be more than 4 years until Arthur Suydam again reappeared on the comic book scene in December of 1990, seemingly without warning or reason. I know that he did illustrations for a number of things, including a few kids' books, the most notable of which being Suydam's work on a fairly well-received new edition of The Wind in the Willows in 1988, which actually went on to earn a sequel with illustrations by Suydam a few years later as well. He was doing general illustration work instead of comics, and I don't know if this work simply paid better or was more artistically fulfilling, or it was all he could get, or what, but Arthur Suydam literally disappeared from the industry after more than a decade of steady work, virtually overnight with no real reason or warning. He hadn't managed to become a superstar, but his work was definitely starting to earn him favor among a lot of younger industry professionals that were coming up at the time, like Sam Keith, who specifically cites Arthur Suydam as one of his major influences. Suydam had a few things reprinted internationally during this 4-year break, but he didn't do any new comic material of any kind that I'm aware of. Following a more than 4-year-long hiatus from comic books, Suydam, however, returned to familiar ground once more in December of 1990 with a 3-issue miniseries, The New Adventures of Cholly and Flytrap, which was once again released by Marvel's Epic imprint, to a lackluster response. It was weird because Cholly and Flytrap, and even Mudwog to a lesser extent, were popular enough to get publishers to keep putting it out, but it wasn't ever popular enough to do much of anything other than make sure that Suydam had something to fall back on when he wanted or needed something to get back on the stands. The art was spectacular, but the writing, which was also handled by Suydam himself, left a lot to be desired in the case of Cholly and Flytrap especially, and for the life of me, I've still no clue what the hell Mudwog is actually about. If Arthur Suydam had been teamed with a talented writer during this high point in his career, I think things might have played out quite differently, but sadly, this was not to be for the young artist, who it feels like basically insisted on writing and drawing his work with an insistent belief that there should be virtually no editorial contribution or input. I don't know this to be a fact, but given Suydam's personality and the derision that he's cast on other comic book writers over the years, it's just a feeling I get. Because of this, while it seemed that mainstream success was just out of his grasp, the following year would change all of that and prove to be one of the most seminal years in Suydam's career. In 1991, Suydam contributed some fairly highly lauded, fully painted covers for the Batman vs. Predator series of the direct market versions for that book. The New Adventures of Cholly and Flytrap was still finishing up publication, and simultaneous to all of this, Marvel also collected the earlier serialized Epic Illustrated Cholly and Flytrap material for the first time in square-bound editions, which they retitled The Original Adventures of Cholly and Flytrap for anyone who might have missed the Epic Illustrated stories, which had begun more than 8 years prior by this point. While somewhat indirectly, Suydam had work for Marvel, DC, and Dark Horse, all published basically simultaneously through 1991. It was crazy. For a guy who hadn't done any work in more than 4 years, Suydam seemed hungry, and the next 2 years were busy ones for the burgeoning artist who seemed to just really be coming into his own after more than 15 years in the industry at this point. Thanks so much for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something. If you did enjoy what you saw, make sure you hit that like button. Think about getting in the comment section below and letting me know. If you really enjoyed what you saw, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell so you never miss another video or premiere again. If you feel like you're in a position to help the channel grow, think about using the link in the description below to sign up for my Patreon page. For as little as $3 a month, you get access to tons of behind the scenes posts, update, exclusive content like uncut interviews, and you can even get your name in the credits. If you want to support the channel but Patreon is not your thing, have no fear. You can finally sign up for membership right here on YouTube. Just hit the little join button and make sure to select the tier and perks that fit you best. If that's not enough, you can also make one-time donations towards specific goals or just tip the channel using the Ko-Fi link in the description below. And you can even pick up your very own JerkComic shirts like the ones you see on the screen now. As always, this video was brought to you by the Jerk Broadcasting Service, as well as generous grants from the Patreon, Ko-Fi, and YouTube members you see on the screen now. I seriously want to thank every single one of you that supports the channel and helps make these videos possible. I really hope the quality and content is getting better, and I can't wait to see where this next year takes us with your continued support. Thank you again for helping this crazy dream of mine become a reality, as well as for sticking with me. I hope you all enjoyed, maybe even learned something. And as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things. Keep hitting those local shops and keep reading comics.